I'm John Heilemann, and this is the Hell and High Water podcast. My guest today is the host of the 7-part podcast series, Nixon at War, Kurt Andersen.
I'm Kurt Andersen, and after 4 years of Donald Trump and spending a year investigating Richard Nixon, I realized that a rotten apple devolved into a very rotten orange.
Hello, Mr. President. How are you? Well, I'm just fine. I haven't had any sleep, but you know how that is.
I sure do, and I give you my congratulations and my sympathy.
Boy, I tell you, isn't that the truth?
I want to try to play this thing as much in the national interest as is humanly possible and as fair as possible, and I believe that your conduct has been very responsible. We're both supposed to be great political animals, but we both want to do what's best for our country, and I think it's awfully important dealing with these comments for the next 4 months for us to be completely informed with the same facts, and then we can do whatever our judgment dictates.
Good deal.
So that is Richard Nixon and Lyndon Baines Johnson in the summer of 1968, right around, I believe, the Republican convention. Kurt Andersen, our guest here today, and the host, producer, presiding genius over an amazing podcast series that has been playing out this summer and is about to come to an end, called Nixon at War. Kurt, also a second-time guest on Hell and High Water. We haven't had many of those. It's good to see you, my friend. How are you doing?
I'm not bad, and it's a complete pleasure to be back here.
First of all, congratulations on the series. It's stunningly good, and
Thank you.
I can't commend it more to people, even in this age where we are replete with podcasts. Some of them extremely good, and some of them mediocre, and some not so great. This one, 7 episodes. And we'll talk more about them in a little more detail, but it's really fantastic. Whether you're a giant history buff or not, and but it takes you into some what might seem to be people who consider themselves familiar with the '60s and familiar with Nixon, familiar territory, and then takes you in a bunch of places that are unfamiliar. That audio we just played is one of many examples of fantastic archival audio throughout the entire thing. So, again, hats off. And I guess that's a good place to start, which is like, why, what for? Like, what was the animating impulse to do this, and what drew you into it, and what were you in the end trying to achieve once you had your arms around the material?
Well, it was the idea of, and my partners on this, Steve Atlas, who had made 2 previous podcast series about Lyndon Johnson, LBJ's War and then Great Society, using this, as you say, fantastic archival tape to explore that. He came to me at an opportune moment when I just finished writing and was preparing to have published my last book, Evil Geniuses. So I had sort of time, and said, I want you to write and host this, which he hadn't done before, really. And I said, let me think about it. And then I had thought about Richard Nixon. I'd lived through Richard Nixon, right? I was a kid. I was a teenager during the Nixon presidency, and I had written a novel that was half set in the late 60s and early 70s, and was significantly about the anti-war movement. And so I thought about it, but I hadn't ever gone deep in a historical research kind of way. I thought, that sounds interesting. And then when I started listening to the tapes, I just ran right down that rabbit hole, because they're amazing. And so many of them we haven't heard. I mean, we think, oh, Nixon tapes. Yeah, we know that. We don't know that. We know the headlines. We know a few bits and pieces. Right. And so I thought also that telling this relatively focused story about Nixon and specifically about Nixon in Vietnam, built from these archival tapes, could tell this story in a new way.
This is the real Nixon, right? The Nixon on the tapes gives you a sense of like why some people beyond his actions looked at him as such a fascinating but dark and anti-Semitic and scheming and paranoid, and all of those qualities that make him Shakespearean really only show up on the tapes. Nixon's public persona was mostly not those things, and his private persona was what he really was, and it was the core of his undoing, and you can only really get it through the tapes in some ways.
No, that's entirely true. And of course, as people have said, and it's true, hearing these tapes and this kind of really deep warts and all exposure of who he was, who Henry Kissinger was, who some of these other people were.
Right.
We're not going to have that, presumably, for, Ronald Reagan, Donald Trump, subsequent people who stopped taping themselves as much as Nixon did. And the thing I didn't really realize about Nixon, which is so fantastically, ironically wonderful, is that he started taping himself obsessively because he was suspicious of and didn't trust Henry Kissinger and others to tell the truth to his history, right? Yeah. He wanted it down for history to show that he was the good guy and it wasn't Kissinger, which is fantastic.
Of course, it's his narcissism that leads to another thing that leads to his undoing. And we're all of us, Kurt, we're all sowing the seeds of our own undoing every day.
Yeah, and here we are taping ourselves. Yeah, what are we doing?
Yes, as we do it. So as you pointed out, right, that the one of the core thematic things is that Nixon is that Watergate and Vietnam are not separate stories, and it's beyond the fact that they are held together by the person of Nixon. But as you said a second ago, first of all, the Pentagon Papers is the thing that triggers Nixon's paranoia, and it triggers it in a very specific way. He starts focusing on one particular set of files that he's worried will also get leaked. If the Pentagon Papers got leaked, somebody else is going to leak this other thing. Where are these files that have to do with the halting of the bombing discussions in 1968? And that's his obsession. Where are they? Got to get them. Maybe within the Brookings Institute. And in fact, you have, and I'm not going to play this sound, but you have this sound from one of the tapes in which he is telling Haldeman, you got to blow up the safe at the Brookings Institute. You got to break into the Brookings Institute, which one of the historians on your podcast says is the only time Nixon's captured on tape actually ordering a criminal act. And certainly you never hear him talk about Watergate on the tapes directly in that way, like ordering Watergate, right? But this is the moment when you hear him actually say, go. He actually refers to it as like he uses the word thievery to describe what he's ordering his people to do. And Haldeman kind of walks out going, what to make of this? I guess we made of it. He wants us to go break into the Brookings Institution.
No, and I didn't know about all this. I mean, historians have. I didn't really know that this was, as you say, historian Ken Hughes, who is the great expert of the Nixon tapes, said, no, this is it. This is when he says, go commit a burglary for our political purposes. And again, you can't make it up. He first started, the first time he said that tape you speak of where he said, blow the safe, break in, I want it done. It was exactly to the day 1 year before the Watergate break-in. So it was, and in fact, I don't want to give it away, but exactly what happened with that proposed heist. But it was where he got the taste for it. And it was, again, that was 4 days after the publication of the Pentagon Papers. So it's very clear that is what, oh my God, they're going to get me. Because it was really like, and I didn't know about this secret file with which he was obsessed, which really existed and exists, full of probably, certainly improperly and maybe illegally gathered information about how he was fiddling with our foreign policy when he was a candidate for president in 1968. So he really thought, oh my God, they've got me. They're going to get me. The liberals are going to get me. They have this. They put out the Pentagon Papers. Now they're going to get me. And the rest is history. So this idea of the draft and stakes and what's going to happen. I was 13 going on 14. It was like, we had potentially all had skin in the game.
At the end of that month, I was 13, sitting there in the TV room as usual with my family. We watched Mr. Objective CBS Evening News anchor Walter Cronkite, freshly back from the war, deliver his special primetime report that ended with this stunning plain truth.
It is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could. This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.
American public opinion started shifting against the war in Vietnam, including mine, quickly. As I finished 8th grade, I turned from this eager beaver Republican campaign volunteer with a Nixon's the One poster on my wall to a pot-smoking, anti-war Abby Hoffman fan.
So I feel like I know you pretty well, and the whole like Nixon's the one poster thing somehow has escaped in our like 30-year friendship. I've never heard about the Nixon's the one poster, so even I learned something here by listening to Nixon at War. Talk about that. Talk about Omaha, Nebraska in 1968 and being Kurt Andersen. I'd just love you to talk about what Walter Cronkite meant to you and what it was like in your home at that point and how that thing did hit you. You talk about it a little bit here. I'd love to hear more.
Sure. I mean, in addition to the Cronkite thing happening, which was everybody said at the moment, it's not just retroactively, whoa, this is a big deal. When you lose Cronkite, you've lost middle America. It happened also that within weeks or days even of this horrible famous thing that also happened of this South Vietnamese general just suddenly escorting this Viet Cong prisoner through the streets of Saigon, raising his gun and shooting him dead, caught in front of journalists. And that was also a very frankly for me as a little kid, more astonishing moment than hearing Walter Cronkite. I mean, yes, Walter Cronkite was as big a deal as everyone says. Now, my change of heart was not so much as a 13 going on 14-year-old kid a result of that. It was being an adolescent in 1968, right? So, but I was this adolescent in, as you say, in Omaha, Nebraska in 1968, the child of old-fashioned, which is to say, not bad Republicans, party of Lincoln, strong defense, free market, Republicans. And because that was the household in which I grew up and you want to please mom and dad, I guess, probably, I was a teenage Republican. I went to teenage Republican camp one summer, this previous summer, I guess it was probably. My older brother, was 18 at the time. And so this idea of the draft and stakes and what's going to happen, I was 13 going on 14, was like, we had potentially all had skin in the game, right? And my parents, and especially my father, were pro-war, the pro-Vietnam War, the anti-communist, part of the anti-communist crusade. This is important to do. So we had arguments and fights and, 4 kids around the dinner table, and I was the youngest, so all my older brothers and sisters were farther along the countercultural transformation than I was. It was good times. It was, my wonder years.
Around the same time, actually a couple months earlier in June of 69, Life magazine does a cover story, which is the faces of the American dead in Vietnam, which, along with Cronkite and the moratorium in '69, is one of those things you can't overstate the impact it had on mainstream centrist apolitical Americans to see Life magazine making the decision, a magazine that largely was all about broadcasting what we imagined to be the most homogenous, most like up with people version of America in the 1950s. And through the middle of the 1960s, suddenly the pictures of the American war dead on the cover of Life magazine in the summer of 1969. And as an illustration of the kind of impact it has, you tell a story about how that magazine impacted your home, which I invite you to tell now, because it was, you don't go into a lot of detail about it, but it seemed quite moving.
No, I remember it very, very distinctly. And actually it was, first of all, I remember because as you described, it was this media thing that hadn't been done. We are now used to generations of, oh, look at all the people who died in 9/11. Oh, look at all the people who died in this disaster or this pandemic or whatever. It hadn't been done. And so every young man who had been killed in Vietnam for a certain week, page after page after page, like a ghastly yearbook. It was a brilliant, tendentious presentation of the war in as you say, this ultimate middle American iconic form. So there, and we were subscribers to Life magazine, and it, and it was a big oversized magazine. It was in every sense a kind of big deal when it arrived every week. And there was my mom. There I was in our kitchen. I can remember it very clearly. That summer, school had just ended, and I was just about to, I'd just ended my 9th grade year, about to go to high school. There's my mom leafing through the new issue of Life, and I didn't know what it was, and she just started crying. So I got up and walked over to her by the kitchen sink, literally the kitchen sink where she was, and I looked and saw what she was doing, and she was looking at this picture after picture of these 18-year-old boys and these 20-year-old boys. Here she is, the mother of a 14-year-old and a 19-year-old boy, just fucking sobbing. And as I say, she was a conservative Republican. She in our family arguments about Vietnam, she left it to my father to have on those accounts, really. But she was by no means any kind of anti-war person, and that was the thing that shifted her. I am convinced to this day. And then later on, she actually in the 90s she became a Democrat. No, it was remarkable, of course, and that was also the year later in the fall, right after the moratorium protests, that Seymour Hersh broke the scoop of the My Lai massacre that had happened a year and a half earlier. So, 1969, and also, of course, the first year of Richard Nixon, when we're starting to Vietnamize the war, it was a big shift year. Donald Trump is this, as I say, a kind of horrible Frankensteinian devolved caricature of Richard Nixon, who, by the way, back then, when we all hated Richard Nixon, he seemed like a very cartoon of evil. But baby, hold my beer.
In San Francisco, a few weeks ago, I saw demonstrators carrying signs reading, "Lose in Vietnam, bring the boys home." Any American has a right to reach that conclusion and to advocate that point of view. But as President of the United States, I would be untrue to my oath of office if I allowed the policy of this nation to be dictated by the minority who hold that point of view and who try to impose it on the nation by mounting demonstrations in the street. And so tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support.
So there it is. A new term of art dropped into the American political vernacular by Richard Nixon, the first invocation of the phrase silent majority. Kurt, you talk in the podcast with Ray Price, Nixon's speechwriter, about the fact that in drafts of the speech, he referred to the silent center, not the silent majority. And Price says he doesn't know how that happened. He didn't have anything to do with it, but it doesn't surprise him because that was the way Nixon thought about things. Talk about it and why, it was incredibly politically successful for him. That speech, was a masterstroke in some ways in terms of his popularity. And as I said, it had a lot of reverberations going forward. So let's talk about the silent majority and its legacy in American politics.
Well, he had run partly on that, shall we call it a plank? It's not a plank. It's this concentrated sense of resentment of the elites, the kids, the hippies, the black people, the uppity unwashed. So that had been part of his 1968 campaign and his kind of American carnage-like nomination acceptance speech, because it was in its enduring power and the wound that it helped gash open and make unclosable in America was this us versus them, educated versus not, working class versus professional class, incidentally white versus black as well, but in this case more the former things, and it as you say, in a short-term way, it kind of stopped the anti-war movement in its tracks a bit and made him popular again, and made his approval of how he was the approval of how he was handling the war in Southeast Asia go up, and so it worked in this short-term way. But it really, because it was so successful, it really convinced him and the right in this country that, this is the way we do it now.
The truth is, there are lots of Republican candidates who, whose attitude was much more traditional towards politics, which traditional in the sense that George W. Bush got elected. People are going to hate me for saying this, but got elected in a very crazy close election in 2000. And the first thing he did was like, I got to grow my majority here. I can't govern as a minority president. I got to get my numbers up. I got to get some people who didn't vote for me to come and vote for me. So what am I going to do? I'm going to do a big bipartisan education reform bill. I'm going to sign up with Ted Kennedy, and I'm going to we'll pass the Senate with 85 votes because I got to get my approval ratings above 47, 48%.
And I'm a compassionate conservative.
Yes. Well, but this is like, I just can't govern with a 48% of the country. I can't govern that way. So it's not whether I forget about ideals or principles. I can't govern by dividing. Politics has got to be about addition, not about subtraction. It's got to be about multiplication, not division. And Trump is, Nixon basically was doing as Farrell says, and as you said, is like, he's very purposely saying, no, division is my strategy, and not trying to bring the country together. And Trump again takes that to profound extremes. And I wonder how many times you watch Trump over the course of the 4 years he was in office, and sort of, especially, now that he's out, and I know this work on this podcast is stretched over some time while he was in and sometime while he was out, but I wonder, both on this front and on others, what the similarities are you see between Trump and Nixon. Obviously, there's some characterological ones that I'm sure you're going to want to riff on because they're kind of obvious. They're if not obvious, they're important. Let's put it that way.
There's this deep insecure neediness for
right.
People tell me I'm great, but no, it's like, I mean, as you very eloquently put it, it's the moment where Trumpism, before God knows it had that name, but that form of hardcore go to your base divisiveness was started. Now Nixon, because he was also governed as the most liberal domestic president between LBJ and Joe Biden. I've been saying it for years, and I remain committed to that. It's true. So he grew, and that was politically canny. He knew, he could get, regular folk to vote for him because, EPA, look, arts endowment, all that stuff, civil rights. So, but it is like one of those devolution charts, right? I mean, so yes, there are similarities. Nixon leads to Trump in all these ways that we've talked about and more, but one was at least trying to stop global nuclear Armageddon. Yeah. One was at least didn't care that much about domestic policy, so let the liberals do what they wanted. But presided over liberal solutions, progressive solutions. My God, did wage and price controls, for which Milton Friedman at the time accused him of being just an evil, horrible socialist sellout.
Created the EPA.
Created the EPA. Created OSHA. I mean, you can go on and on. I mean, it's amazing. So, here was a guy who was within the normal range of evil and decency, craziness, insanity, and all those things that, frankly, most presidents have some combination of all those things. I mean, and we, most of this work was done on Nixon at War during 2020, as Donald Trump was declining into new lows of insanity and ugliness. And so the way in which, and whether it's meddling with foreign policy is, of course, and colluding with a foreign government, or neediness, or get those protesters, shoot them if necessary. Right. I mean, it was like, wait, this phrase, this line attributed to Mark Twain that I quote a lot, and Twain probably never said, which is that history doesn't repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes.
Yeah.
My God. Donald Trump is this, as I say, a kind of horrible Frankensteinian devolved caricature of Richard Nixon, who, by the way, back then, when we all hated Richard Nixon, he seemed like a very cartoon of evil. But baby, hold my beer.
Yeah,
See what you get in 50 years.
The podcast is fantastic. Everyone should listen to it. You will find it, hopefully, it's 10 times better than this conversation. I thought this conversation was pretty good. So
I have never had a better media conversation about anything I've ever done than this one we just had. There may be some that are equal, but never had a better one.
Well, you're nice to say that, and it was great to see you, and well, to be continued, which is really the only way to end any conversation with you, because I'll see you probably in a couple weeks.
Hasta la vista, amigo.
All right, brother. See you later. Thank you very much, Kurt Andersen.